This is the story of Daniel Mercer and his wife, Claire Mercer. They had been married for 9 years, long enough to have built something real, and long enough to have quietly stopped tending to it. Daniel was a man who believed that love, once earned, became a kind of permanent structure, something that didn't require daily maintenance so much as occasional acknowledgement. Claire had believed that once too, or had told herself she did. The truth she had buried somewhere beneath the routine was simpler and more uncomfortable. She had wanted to be seen in a way that Daniel no longer knew how to do. Not because he was cruel, because he was certain. And certainty, she had come to understand, could be its own form of abandonment. What unraveled between them unraveled slowly. The way a hem comes loose not from one pull, but from 1,000 ordinary frictions. And by the time Daniel stood in the doorway of Caruso's bar on a Wednesday evening and saw his wife sitting too close to a man whose hand rested on the small of her back, the fraying had already been going on for years. He just hadn't looked down. The morning before it happened was unremarkable in the way most mornings had become. Daniel made coffee while Claire stood at the bathroom mirror, and they moved around each other in the kitchen with the practiced efficiency of two people who had long since memorized each other's rhythms. He poured a mug for her without asking, 2 sugars, a splash of oat milk, and set it on the counter beside where she would stand when she came down. It was a loving gesture. It was also automatic. He had stopped thinking about it somewhere around year 4, and she had stopped mentioning that she'd switched back to regular milk 8 months ago. She drank the oat milk anyway. It was easier. "I'll be late tonight," she said, coming downstairs and picking up the mug. "The Henderson account needs to be finalized." "I'll leave something in the oven," he said, already looking at his phone. That was the texture of their mornings. Competent, coordinated, bloodless. Daniel worked in urban planning for the city, a job that suited him, that he was genuinely good at. And that had the unfortunate quality of consuming him in increments so gradual he'd never noticed the consumption. He was thorough, methodical, and he brought the same qualities home. The bills were never late. The car was always serviced. He remembered anniversaries and birthdays, and the names of Claire's colleagues' children. He was present in all the ways that looked like love from a distance. Up close, Claire had come to feel that she was living with someone who had organized their life together with extraordinary care and then lost interest in what lived inside it. She hadn't told him this. That was her flaw. She processed inward and waited for him to notice, and he was not a man who noticed the things that weren't said. At work, Daniel had a reputation for being steady. His colleague Marcus often said, "Mercer's the guy you want in the room when everything's on fire, because he's going to look at the floor plan and figure out where the fire exits are." It was meant as a compliment. Daniel accepted it as one. He didn't examine whether he had ever, even once, let himself simply stand in the fire. He'd been passing by Caruso's that Wednesday because he'd gone to pick up a bottle of wine from the shop 2 doors down. A spontaneous impulse. One of those small gestures he sometimes made when he sensed something unspoken accumulating between them. He'd thought, "Claire's been quiet this week. We'll have wine. We'll sit on the back porch." The bar had its front window open to the street. He saw her before he processed what he was seeing. Claire was seated at a corner table, turned partially away from the window, her posture different from how she sat at home, looser somehow, and more alive. The man across from her was laughing at something she'd said, and her hand had come up to touch her own collarbone the way she did when she was pleased with herself. Daniel knew that gesture. He had not cost it in a long time. The man's hand moved her lower back as they both leaned in to look at something on her phone. It was brief, maybe 3 seconds, but it was the ease of it, the way neither of them flinched or registered it as a crossing, that told Daniel everything he would spend the next few weeks trying to unknow. He stood on the pavement for a moment that felt structurally different from ordinary moments, the kind that rearranged the load-bearing walls of a life. Then he walked to the wine shop, bought the bottle of Chablis he'd intended to buy, and drove home. He left the wine on the counter. He did not open it. When Claire came home at 9:30, he was reading in the living room, and he looked up and he said, "How was it?" And she said, "Long, fine." And he nodded and looked back at his book. That nod was the most precisely painful thing he had done in years, and he didn't know it yet. He didn't sleep much that week. He moved through it with the surface intact: work, dinner, the small logistical conversations that structured their shared existence, while underneath something had begun rearranging itself with quiet, methodical devastation. He found himself studying her in the way he hadn't in years, but differently now. Not with the soft attention of desire, but with the sharp and miserable attention of a man trying to figure out how long he'd missed something. He noticed things. She kept her phone face down now. She had always been casual with it before, leaving it on the counter, the table, the arm of the sofa. Now it traveled with her. It was a small shift, but once he'd seen it, he couldn't unsee it. She laughed more on calls she took in the hallway, not more frequently, but differently. There was a lightness in it that she didn't carry into the rooms where he was. She'd started going to the gym on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, a habit she'd begun in March and which he'd found unremarkable until now, when he found himself calculating exactly how many Tuesdays and Thursdays had passed. He did not confront her. This was partly his nature. He distrusted confrontation that hadn't been fully prepared for, and partly something else, something he would only name for himself much later. He was afraid that if he asked, she would tell him, and then the life they'd built would have to be actively dismantled. And he was not yet ready to do that. The cowardice and the love were indistinguishable. Meanwhile, he looked up the man. He'd only seen him briefly through the bar window, but he'd seen enough. Mid-40s, dark jacket, the build of someone who ran for a reason other than health. He found him eventually, as people always do now, through the logic of mutual connections on a professional network. Thomas Avery, an architect. He and Claire had worked on a shared project 6 months ago involving a commercial redevelopment in the east quarter of the city. Daniel saw the project listed on both their profiles. Thomas Avery was married. There was a photo from a charity event dated 14 months ago. His wife's name in the caption was Rachel. Daniel sat with that for a long time. He tried to think about Rachel Avery and found he couldn't assemble her clearly. Only the name, the fact of her existence, and the specific weight of what that existence implied. She didn't know either. Or she did. He had no way to tell. Claire came into the home office that Thursday evening and found him staring at his screen, and she said, "You're going to damage your eyes. Come to bed." He looked up. Her hair was down, the way she used to wear it more often. She looked tired but soft, and for a moment he felt the full and terrible weight of what 9 years looked like. All of it, the good, the slow erosion, the bottle of wine still sitting unopened on the counter because he'd bought it the night everything changed. "I'll be up in a bit," he said. She hesitated. He would think about that hesitation later, how it lasted almost 2 seconds, how her eyes searched his face for something. He kept his expression neutral, which was the thing he did best, and she turned and left. He closed the laptop without looking anything else up. What he felt was not rage. That surprised him. It was something closer to grief, preemptive, quiet, the kind that arrives before the full facts do and sits with you while you wait. He opened the wine that night, alone at the kitchen counter, at 11:43. He drank one glass slowly and poured the rest out. It felt in some way he couldn't have articulated, like a small ceremony for something that was already gone. She came to him on a Sunday. He hadn't asked. He hadn't staged anything. He had simply, in the 2 weeks since the bar window, become a degree cooler. Not cold, not hostile, just less present. And Claire, who had been watching this shift with the specific alertness of someone who knows they are being watched, apparently decided she could not sustain the ambiguity. He was in the garden when she came outside, wearing the gray cardigan she wore when she was anxious. And she sat down in the chair across from him and said, very quietly, "I think we need to talk." He set down the mug he was holding. He waited. "I don't know how to start," she said. "Try." She looked at her hands. There was. I don't want to use that word. I don't think it was." She stopped, recalibrated. It was emotional, mostly emotional. I don't know if that distinction matters to you. It doesn't, he said. His voice was even. That evenness cost him something. His name is I Know Who He Is. She looked up. The surprise on her face was real, and then the relief that he already knew that she didn't have to construct the revelation. And then, behind the relief, something more complex. Shame, yes, but also, he realized, a kind of recognition, as if some part of her had wanted him to already know, had needed him to have seen it, the way people who have been invisible for too long will do something visible, even if visibility breaks things. How long? He asked. 5 months. I want to stop. I want to understand what happened between us. What happened between us? He repeated slowly, not as a question, but turning it over. Daniel. She reached across the small table. He didn't pull his hand away, but he didn't turn it over to hold hers either. I know you've been. Don't, he said. Not unkindly. Don't tell me what I've been. She was quiet. I need you to understand, she said eventually, that I'm not saying it was your fault. I'm not trying to shift it. But I felt, her voice caught, I felt like furniture for a long time, like something that had been arranged properly and didn't need to be looked at again. He thought about the coffee mug, the oat milk she'd never mentioned, the dozens of small thoughtfulnesses that had calcified into assumptions. I know I stopped looking, he said. It came out differently than he expected, not as a confession or an excuse, but as the simple and devastating acknowledgement of fact. I thought looking wasn't something you needed to keep doing. Everybody needs to keep being seen. The garden was quiet. Somewhere in the street behind them, a car passed. So what do you want? He asked. I want to fix it. He looked at her for a long time. She was still the woman he'd married. That was part of what made it so difficult. She wasn't a stranger, which was what he'd half expected to feel. She was entirely familiar, and familiar in a way that made the betrayal more intimate, not less. She had taken the particular knowledge of being close to him and used it to construct an argument for her own absence. I need time, he said. Not yes, not no, just that. She nodded and went inside. He sat in the garden for another hour until the cold became uncomfortable enough to require moving, and then he moved. He was in a hotel for 6 weeks before they agreed he would come back to the house. He'd framed it as space for thinking. Claire had accepted this framing with the gratitude of someone who has been granted something they know they don't deserve. She texted him with a careful consistency, not too often, not performatively, and he responded with an honesty that she perhaps hadn't expected. Not warmth, but real sentences. He was, even now, a man who believed in decency as a practice, not a bargaining chip. Somewhere in the second week, a message arrived from an unknown number. You're Daniel Mercer. I believe we have something in common. My name is Rachel Avery. He stared at it for a long time. They met at a neutral coffee shop on a Tuesday. He'd always disliked Tuesdays now, he realized. Some association with the gym schedule that he'd never been able to shake. Rachel Avery was not what he'd imagined, which meant he'd been imagining the wrong things. She was contained, precise, clearly intelligent, with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been doing the emotional labor of suspecting something for a long time while managing to function. How did you find me? He asked. The project files. Tom left his laptop open. It wasn't difficult. She paused. I've known something was wrong for 8 months. I just needed a person, not a suspicion. What do you want to do? She'd looked at him directly. I'm not sure yet. I know what I don't want, which is to pretend I don't know, and I don't want a scene that lets them play the victim afterward. I want them to have to face it in a way they can't reframe. He understood exactly what she meant. He had spent 9 years with a woman who was skilled at reframing. They talked for 2 hours. It was not the conversation he'd expected. Neither of them performed their grievances. They spoke with the specific register of 2 people trying to think clearly in circumstances that made clear thinking difficult. And somewhere in that attempt, a recognition formed. Not attraction, not yet. Something earlier than that? the sense of someone moving through the same dark in a way that felt familiar. What they did eventually was pragmatic rather than vindictive. They each chose a person from their mutual social circle, someone connected to Tom and Claire's professional overlapping world, and they arranged to be present at a work function the following month. Both of them, together, knowing what they knew, not staged for exposure, not planned as theater. Just present, in a way that made Tom Avery go still when he saw them together, made Claire's smile die before it was fully formed. Nothing was said publicly, nothing needed to be. What it did was remove the comfortable darkness. The affair had existed in private architecture, and private architecture requires everyone involved to not look directly at the walls. When Rachel and Daniel arrived at that function side by side, not intimate, just adjacent, just knowing, both Tom and Claire understood simultaneously that the architecture had changed. Tom Avery ended things the following week. Daniel knew because Claire told him. She came to him with it not as a confession but as an offering, and he recognized the distinction. She had not come to say, "I chose you." She had come to say, "It's over," and she was hoping he would understand this as proximity to choosing him. He didn't say anything for a while. "I met Rachel," he said eventually. She had not known. The color shifted in her face. "We talked," he said. "She's—" He paused. He was going to say remarkable, and then he thought better of it. "She's handling it." What he didn't say was that he'd had dinner with Rachel twice more since the coffee shop, that they had talked about their respective marriages with the honesty that neither of them had managed inside those marriages, that there was nothing physical between them, and that the absence of it was beginning to feel like a deliberate choice rather than a given. He wasn't ready to name what that meant. He moved back into the house in October. He and Claire began couples therapy with a woman named Dr. Patricia Holt, who had a gentle manner and the particular skill of asking questions that sounded simple and weren't. He attended all the sessions. He was honest in them. He did the work, but he had begun to notice something. He was doing the work the same way he'd always done things, methodically, responsibly, showing up in all the ways that looked like love from a distance. He wasn't sure anymore what it looked like up close. They lasted until February. Not because of a final catastrophe, because of a Tuesday evening in early February when they were sitting after dinner, and Claire said something kind, something warm. "I've been thinking about taking a trip. Just us, maybe Portugal." And Daniel looked at her from across the table and felt only a vast, settled quietness, where something else had once lived. He didn't say anything right away. He refilled his glass. He looked out the window at the dark garden where he had sat the day she had told him, 9 months ago now, and he thought about what Dr. Bersaden Holt had said in their last session. "The question worth sitting with is whether you're working to rebuild what was there, or working to be the person who tried." He had been the person who tried. "I don't think I can do Portugal," he said. Claire set down her fork. She had the look of someone who had been waiting for this, who perhaps had been waiting for it since October, who had understood before he did that his return to the house was an act of decency and not an act of wanting. "Is there someone else?" she asked. Her voice was steady. It was the right question. He gave it the consideration it deserved. "Not yet," he said, which was honest, and which told her everything. She nodded once, a slow downward movement of the head that contained something he could not fully read. Grief, yes, but something adjacent to relief, which shamed her visibly. The way the involuntary body sometimes reveals things the deliberate face works to hide. "I think we both know what this is," he said. "Yes." They sat there for a few minutes in the kitchen they had shared for 8 years, with the ordinary objects of a shared life arranged around them. The fruit bowl, the cookbooks, the photograph from their 3rd anniversary on the wall, and neither of them performed anything. There was no scene, no crescendo. Just two people at the worn end of something, honest enough at last to call it by its name. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know. Are you?" He thought about it. "I'm sorry we lost each other before I noticed. I'm sorry I thought love was something you installed and didn't have to maintain." He paused. I'm sorry I made you feel like furniture. I didn't see it. I should have. She was crying quietly, not dramatically, the way people cry when the sadness is old and settled rather than sudden. I didn't have to do what I did, she said. No, I knew that. I think I was trying to feel something before I was brave enough to say I wasn't feeling it anymore. I know that too, he said. And he did. He left at the end of the month, not bitterly, with boxes, with arrangements, with a civility that their friends would later call admirable. And that was not, in fact, admirable so much as simply what they both knew how to do. He saw Rachel Avery in March for dinner in a restaurant with small tables and low light. She looked tired and cleaner, somehow, than she had in the months before. The way people sometimes look when they have stopped carrying something that had grown too heavy. They talked for 3 hours. He told her about February. She told him that the divorce papers had been filed in January. What do you want now? She asked. He thought about what he told Claire. Not yet. I want to learn how to look at something and keep looking, he said. I want to stop assuming that presence is the same as attention. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, That's the most honest thing I've heard someone say in a year. He paid the bill. They walked out into the cold together, two people standing at the beginning of something that neither of them intended to build too quickly or too certainly, because they had both lived long enough inside certainty to understand exactly what it cost. Somewhere on the other side of the city, Claire sat in the house that was now only hers, in the kitchen with the fruit bowl and the cookbooks, looking at the wall where the photograph had been, at the clean square of paint that the frame had protected all those years from the slow dimming of the light. Love doesn't always end in fire. Sometimes it ends in February, at a kitchen table with a glass of wine and an honest sentence, and the quiet sound of two people finally saying the thing that had been living between them for years, unsaid, the way a room can be full of air and still, somehow, lack breath. She had known before he had. That was its own grief. He had seen, finally, when it was too late to save it. That was his, and what remained for both of them was not wreckage exactly, but the particular and necessary work of learning how to inhabit themselves more truthfully than they had known how to inhabit each other.